This is our episode on utilitarianism and deontology. I'm super excited to be with you this week, and we have an extra special guest to be revealed later on in the show, so everything is very, very exciting. I'm Martin, and I'm with Lawrence and a mystery guest that you'll meet shortly. And this is a podcast for everyone, whether you are new to the LD debate game, whether you've been on it for some time, whether you're a competitor, whether you're a coach, whether you're just someone who just likes to have a good time or listen to the soothing sound of Lawrence's voice. This is a podcast for you. One quick note before we get into the thick of things. Thank you to our sponsor for the podcast, Victory Briefs. They're a Lincoln Douglas debate news site, as well as a Lincoln Douglas debate camp that you can go to the Summer Institute over the summer and learn from some of the best of the best. I recently signed on to be one of the instructors there this year, and I'm really excited to get to do that. So, Lawrence, how do you feel about Victory Briefs?
It's a good camp, and in fact, you can go to their Facebook page right now and see a bright, shining picture of Martin when he graduated. And our mystery guest also works at Victory Briefs, so stay tuned to find out who it is.
So, last week we had a choreography episode, and before that we had an art of war episode. This episode is our scholarship episode. In this episode, we'll talk about some know-how, some just actual factual knowledge that you should probably have going into Lincoln Douglas debate tournaments. This is designed to help all of us, and I mean, my philosophy is kind of shaky on this as well, so I'm excited to learn from some of the best about what we're talking about today. But some issues you can think about and resolve before you even get into a debate round. And this is an episode where we'll talk about that. So today we're going to talk, as I said, about utilitarianism and deontology. This is probably, inside or outside Lincoln Douglas debate, one of the most important philosophical clashes that exists in philosophy. And we'll be really excited to talk with you about this right now. Before we get into the think of this util versus deont thing, we'd like to welcome our special guest, Catherine Kenny. How are you, Catherine?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast. We're really excited to have you. Where did you go to high school? You debated in high school.
Yeah, I debated for 4 years at Harrison High School in Harrison, New York.
Oh, awesome. I think I judged you at one point. Have I judged you?
I think you've judged me at least once, maybe a few times.
I know I judged you at the CFL National Tournament.
I know you did as well, which is kind of funny, but I think that you might have judged me at the Mid-American Cup as well.
Oh yeah, probably. Well, in any case, Lawrence, how do you know Catherine?
I actually have never judged Catherine, but when I was going into senior year, I met Catherine at Victory Briefs when I was also a camper, and then we worked together at the Victory Briefs Institute last year, and Catherine is coming back again this year, so have known Catherine for like 4 or 5 years now. That's like a long time.
Oh, Catherine, you were friends with Shreya, right? At least at one point?
Yeah, I'm still good friends with her.
Oh, Shreya's the best. Maybe we should have Shreya on the podcast at one point.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. See if she's interested.
Ideas. Well, anyway, on to our main topic of discussion. So we're going to talk to you all today about utilitarianism and deontology. And Lawrence, can you kind of talk to us about maybe what are the central themes of the conflict between util and deontology?
Yeah, so without getting into the nitty-gritty of the philosophical justifications and explanations of what util, or utilitarianism shortened as util usually, and deontology, generally shortened as deont, it's really the core controversy of a lot of Lincoln Douglas debate topics, and it's really the core controversy of a lot of ethical conflicts outside of debate. I think probably the greatest conflict in philosophy is just the simple question, do the ends justify the means? And this is really a demonstration of the core conflict between utilitarianism and deontology, and we'll explain which side is which and why they are on which side of the question. And even basic topics like individual rights versus the general good, or liberty versus security conflicts, or even recent debates about, like, for example, NSA surveillance and privacy are all really questions about utilitarianism versus deontology and which ethical system we ought to adopt, and which one, makes more sense in any particular situation. And it's a really common conflict in debate, and so much so that it's probably even prevalent in the topic for March, April that just came out about the right to housing, because there's some utilitarian versus deontology conflict inherent in the resolution. So it's just everywhere.
And I'm sure we'll talk about that when we get to the March, April episode of the podcast, which will probably be something like next week. So, do the ends justify the means? Individual rights versus the general good. Catherine, can you talk with us about the trolley problem, kind of what that is?
Yeah, of course. So the basic example of the trolley problem arises when you have the opportunity to pull the lever to decide which track the trolley goes on. As of now, the trolley is heading towards a big group of people. Unclear how big the group is, but it's a lot greater than one. But if you decide to pull the lever and redirect the trolley, it will go onto a track that only has one person standing on it, meaning that you would be saving a bunch of people, but instead killing one. Another difference arises when the trolley is already on track to kill the other people, so you wouldn't have to do anything substantial or any action at all if you were going to let them die. Meanwhile, if you decided to pull the lever and kill the one person to save the many, you would be committing an action as opposed to an omission.
So this is more like so this is a thought experiment, right? You're just like
Yeah.
you're trying to decide what to do, and what are kind of the situation that you find yourself in? You're like overlooking some trolley. Is that and it's going down a hill? It's gonna hit some people.
Yeah, it can either hit one person or a group of people, and then it's up to you to either pull the lever to save the group of people, but then in turn kill the one person, or let the trolley run its track in which it would kill the big group of people.
Oh, okay. So basically, you have this lever, and if you don't pull the lever, it's going to kill the big group of people, and if you do pull the lever, it kills the smaller group of people.
Exactly.
So what's the dilemma? Wouldn't you just always just save the bigger group?
Well, some people might think that, but you have to remember that if you were going to let the other group of people, or the larger group of people, die, you would not be acting and you would not be pulling the lever. Rather, you would simply just be letting the trolley hit those people, meaning that it would be an omission, i.e., you're not actively doing something to save them, but you're not actively causing them to die.
That's very interesting. So there's so then, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the major sort of conflicts in utilitarianism and deontology is between whether or not there's a difference between acting and failing to act.
Yeah,
sort of actions,
definitely.
Omissions.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I think that the act of continue.
I was just gonna say so I was just gonna ask Lawrence maybe what he thought about the act omission distinction and maybe its importance.
Yeah, and it's definitely something we'll cover in a short bit after we get into the details of what utilitarianism and deontology is. But as Catherine mentioned earlier, it is a central component of the trolley problem, like the most famous philosophical thought experiment that exists. Like, is there something wrong with just letting those people die? Or are you, in fact, required to take an action and kill one person to save many? And, this is core controversy. Now, the good news about the trolley problem in this variation is that the vast majority of people in the United States, and even around the world, think that the correct solution is just to pull the lever. So even though there are some, as Catherine mentioned earlier, who say, you can just let the trolley continue on its way and kill the larger group of people, most of us would probably agree that we should pull the lever. But the trolley problem becomes more complicated when you throw in additional factors or, different scenarios for the trolley problem.
But what if you like really don't like the people that are going to get hit?
That is a good question. Is it permissible to value the life of those people that you don't like above someone that you
What if
don't
this is
know, or
someone
vice versa?
what if this is someone like when you were in the second grade that was just like a fourth grader that just picked on you mercilessly? Like
I'm not sure if they're.
does that change the equation? What do you think, Catherine?
Um, I mean, I don't think that I hold a grudge against anyone from second grade to that
Hmm.
extent, so I don't know if that would necessarily change my opinion. But I think
Fair
that in this
enough.
specific stance, I would be one to pull the lever.
Hmm. I would also pull the lever, because I don't think that there's an act omission distinction, but maybe we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later. So, um, so utilitarianism and deontology, these are value criterion arguments, basically. I mean, you can put them at the value, but really they're criterion arguments. That's where the meat of the debate is occurring. Do you all agree?
Yeah, definitely. I think that a lot of the times, if there's going to be clash in the value, it kind of becomes irrelevant by the end of the debate. Meanwhile, if the value criterions are utilitarianism, or things such as like maximizing happiness or maximizing expected well-being versus a deontic criterion, there's going to be a lot of clash there, and I think that's where the meat
Hmm.
of the debate's going to come down to.
The meat of the debate. Sounds good. Um, so, um, so as for making like act omission distinction and ends justify the means arguments, before we get into some strict definition stuff, do you have any? I assume you have some experience deploying these arguments in debate rounds.
Yeah, definitely. I've actually never ran a framework about utilitarianism before.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, but I have run a few positions about deontology, specifically on the topic about um, autonomous medical choices for adolescents. I had a deontology affirmative case that I ran in most rounds.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's jump into some definitions parts. So first, we're going to talk about what is utilitarianism, and then we're going to talk about what is deontology. Before we get into some specific stuff about what is utilitarianism, though, um, there is this thing called consequentialism that I think maybe it's important to understand first. Consequentialism is just the theory, and correct me if I'm wrong, that consequences are really the things that are important, that we should maximize good consequences and minimize bad consequences. Is that right, Lawrence?
Yeah, as a general category for philosophical arguments, right? Yeah.
So for example, you could have a consequentialist framework about pretty much anything, right? I mean, I could have a consequentialist framework of 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 maximizing doormats, right? I mean, like that's
I'm not
I don't know
sure
how good
which
my warrants would be, but
yeah, not sure which philosopher has a long paper in a philosophy journal about doormats being intrinsically good, but sure, I guess you could read that as your criterion.
don't worry, I'll send you some notes after the podcast. But so consequentialism says it's important to maximize good consequences, minimize bad consequences. Catherine, are you familiar with any theories that are sort of not utilitarian but that are consequentialist?
Um, I know that in many debate rounds, when issues of structural violence come up, i.e., types of oppression, a lot of the times the actual case will look to the consequences of an action because
Hmm.
that seems to be relevant to this type of debate.
No, yeah, that's exactly right, and we're seeing those frameworks pop up like more and more these days. So,
Mm.
yeah. That makes sense. Now, so utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism, and what does utilitarianism care about, Catherine?
Utilitarianism cares about happiness kind of as a state of affairs, in addition to things such as life or maximizing well-being, which are traditional theories of the good used in value criterions.
Okay. And by well-being, that's kind of just like that's like happiness, like plus sort of your mental state, basically.
So maximizing pleasure, basically, or minimizing pain.
Okay. So, Lawrence, who are some of the main people that started up, who started up philosophy, like the utilitarian philosophy?
Yeah, so the first main utilitarianism was this guy called Jeremy Bentham, and he attempted to create a theory of utilitarianism that was just called act utilitarianism, and you just do whatever action sort of maximizes happiness and minimizes pain, because he thought happiness was intrinsically good, and that's what made humans like valuable is their ability to feel happiness, and that pain was intrinsically bad for no other reason than like hey, happiness is good, pain is bad. He also developed this thing called the hedonistic calculation, and hedonism just refers to like being like with happiness. And he tried to create a mathematical calculation for how to determine what is objectively more happy for other people and less happy for other
A
people.
mathematical calculation, really?
Yeah, it failed horribly, which is why and it's and he's a strange person because he actually like had his like body stuffed and like he's actually his body is still at display at like some British philosophical society, and every year Benthamites or followers of Jeremy Bentham will like come out and like dine around his body or something like that because he's just really obsessed with himself.
Oh my
But
God!
so
How about
Bentham's
I've heard about this? This is
yeah,
crazy.
it's really weird. Like I thought it was a joke at first, but I mean, both my philosophy professor and like a bunch of different websites are like, yeah, Bentham was like a weird person. So yeah, there's Bentham, and he developed that theory, but it fell apart on a bunch of different levels. Most notably, the hedonistic calculation was impossible to use because there's no real objective way to like measure happiness because Bentham had weird categories for what counted as happiness, but almost every single time the conclusion would come out wrong in the end. And because if you just act to maximize happiness, it's really hard to have a rule to follow in life. So he had a student named John Stuart Mill who became.
Before that, though, one quick question about Bentham. Have you taken any economics classes, by the way, Lawrence?
Oh yeah, I've taken basic econ.
So there's just like I took some economics classes in college as well, and a lot of the util stuff that was kind of discredited in philosophy by Bentham, like a lot of it kind of appears in economics, doesn't it? Like there's a lot of like utility curves and stuff like that I see.
Well, I mean, kind of, but like Bentham's examples of like the hedonistic calculus were like much different from what we would like consider modern theories of how to calculate utilitarianism, like the utility curve or like diminishing marginal returns, et cetera, et cetera. His like utility criterion list was ridiculous because it had like set categories for what counted as happiness. So like one of those was duration, for instance, and it counted equally compared to other categories, which was kind of a silly way to measure happiness.
Duration.
Yeah.
So you like multiply how good it feels by like how long it lasted.
Yeah, I don't remember the specifics because obviously this is a discredited theory.
Fair enough.
But we did a few examples in philosophy class, and it turned out that every single time, the objectively better thing to do in the utilitarian sense. So, for example, study for a test as opposed to like eat a Snickers bar, would lose because they arbitrarily gave so much weight to other categories of happiness that like the candy bar would just win every single time. Like it'd be like give money to charity or eat a candy bar, and almost every single time the candy bar would win because his hedonistic calculator was just so off.
Sounds like a good moral theory. Just eat
Yeah.
lots of candy bars all the time. Vote affirmative. Okay, so you were about to talk about a good man named John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, so the reason why we still use utilitarianism today, despite Jeremy Bentham's horrible theory of utilitarianism, is because he had a prodigy student named John Stuart Mill who took it upon himself to improve the theory of utilitarianism. So he kept a lot of the core assumptions, which were like happiness is intrinsically good, pain is intrinsically bad, like don't torture other people, don't murder them, et cetera, but then reformulated it into what we would now consider sort of rule utilitarianism, which is just to follow general rules that, if followed by most people, would make society and overall like people happier in the end and less sad, basically. And he developed a bunch of different like formulations for this, including writing this giant book called On Liberty, which he has a bunch of different ways to calculate what is good and what is bad. And it's a really strong defense of why liberty is good, because his argument is that if we have more liberty, then we will know what's best for ourselves, and we'll make choices that maximize our own happiness in the end, et cetera, et cetera. But he's definitely just more known for the rule utilitarian formulation in contrast to Bentham's formulation. And he developed the liberty part to help counter Bentham's old hedonistic calculator, which failed.
Doesn't Mill say at one point that like music is like really pleasurable and great?
Yeah, he has
other
like
things. He's like orders of pleasure.
Yeah, he's like this thing about higher order pleasures versus lower order pleasures, and he's like higher order pleasures are like Shakespeare. Those are just objectively better than all the lower order pleasures. Like, I think most modern philosophers use the example of The Simpsons, which is what Michael Sandel uses in his book to describe John Stuart Mill, and Mill was of the conclusion that Shakespeare was just objectively better than the trash that is like The Simpsons, for instance.
What? The Simpsons is great
because he objectively a higher order pleasure. It had to be because it appealed to the rational sense of human beings, and that made it better for some reason. Whereas The Simpsons appealed to like the low end of people because it was like quote unquote a stupid show. And obviously Mill was not writing about The Simpsons since Mill is like hundreds of years dead, but like similar, trashy entertainment of his time. So yeah, he thought like music was intrinsically good, Shakespeare was intrinsically good, or like intrinsically better than all the other forms of happiness out there. So
How about human life? Does that contribute to happiness?
Well, what do you mean by that?
So, in a lot of util debates I've seen, I just wanted to clear something up. A lot of the times, people justify utilitarianism on the basis of happiness being good. And then they have contentions that are sort of about body count, that are kind of about numbers of people that you save. And I just wanted to clarify that the sort of basic assumption there is obviously that human life has positive happiness value.
Yeah, yes. And that being dead prevents you from experiencing
more
any
utils.
Pleasure. Yeah. Our goal is to maximize utility in the world, so saith the utilitarians.
So Catherine, have you ever had any like rule util? Have you ever debated against a rule util, something like John Stuart Mill, before?
I don't know if I have in round, but it was a really big topic at debate camp going into my junior year of high school. We did a lot of debates on it, mainly whether we should look to rule util in comparison to other philosophies like deontology that we're talking about, and even in comparison to act util, which is sometimes more prevalent in debate rounds.
Yeah, I don't think I ever actually debated against a rule utilitarian argument. I think it was just act util that I debated against.
I think those common criterions like maximizing expected well-being is kind of a more rule utilitarian argument, because it's not saying that we should maximize actual well-being. It's just what rule should we adopt that, if followed, would maximize utility or happiness in the world.
Yeah, so the way that I like to think about rule utilitarianism is just like, it's kind of the difference between a world with laws and a world without laws. I think that law is kind of a very good example of a rule utilitarian argument, with the basic idea being like, look, sometimes it might not maximize happiness to arrest people for murder, let's say. But the cost of breaking the no murdering rule is just too great. With the general idea being, look, here are some rules. If we always followed these rules, the world would be better. Is that the... Yeah. That's the basic idea, right? So the idea is that in a world where nobody murders is actually a better world where some people murder, even if that murder would produce more utility in that one specific case, because then like the general norm against murder is just out the window, right? Then right. Then you'll look outside, there'll be chaos, cats and dogs living together, all this bad stuff. And the general idea for rule utilitarianism is, look, sometimes you might really want to break a rule, but you have to weigh the amount of benefits of breaking that rule is versus the entire rule going away, because then all of a sudden the rule is no longer useful. And the idea for rule utilitarianism is like, that rule, like following the let's not steal from anybody rule, is just like a much better thing to have around than not have around. Like it has a bunch of utility value, so we shouldn't break the rules that are associated with it. Yeah, we actually have the school that I coach. We have a lay case. I had a case that I wrote with a novice about rule utilitarianism on this topic, actually, the January-February topic. We wrote a case that basically was designed to get out of negative counterexamples. Because on this resolution, I don't know. I know Lawrence coaches people on this resolution. I don't know about you, Catherine, but the resolution, most of the negative arguments are related to like various counterexamples, and one thing that we did was we figured that if we could justify rule utilitarianism, we could then say, oh, maybe it would seem nice to allow some speech codes in the case of this one example, but maybe it wouldn't benefit us in the long run.
Yeah. And, well, the good news is also that John Stuart Mill was just a huge defender of free speech and liberty as part of his justification for rule utilitarianism. So.
Yeah, John Stuart Mill is honestly the man. He's just real good. Okay, so let's talk about some common justifications for utilitarianism. So one of them has to do with the social contract. Catherine, can you explain kind of just what the social contract is, sort of very quickly, and then explain how that sort of works to justify utilitarianism?
Okay. So basically, before there was a government that people lived under, everyone lived in a state of nature, meaning a state that had no rules, and with no rules, there was no one to adjudicate between certain rights violations. So if I went up to someone and was just like, I'm going to take your hat, and I took it, then they said, no, I don't want you to take my hat because it's mine. There'd be no one to adjudicate between both of our claims, even though obviously I was wrong in stealing the hat. Thus, the citizens are going to enter under this agreement, i.e. the social contract, with the state. It's kind of like a social contract because the people are signing a contract, which is hypothetical, obviously, to enter into the society to begin with. And what happens is that now the government is able to adjudicate between the certain claims, and there are these set rules that say things such as no stealing, in addition to things such as no murdering with certain moral implications, and also things such as no jaywalking or other traffic laws that are made in order to help the overall efficiency of the society. And although we do lose some rights violations, such as I can't go out and steal if I want to, in turn, we're given so many other rights, which makes this hypothetical agreement or social contract worth it.
So I always made the argument in debate that this kind of justified utilitarianism because it meant that the point of the government was that the reason that the government was formed was to protect citizens, was to protect the rights of citizens from each other, and obviously the government is doing a poor job if they're allowing a bunch of citizens to die.
Yeah, definitely. The government has to uphold their end of the social contract by protecting the citizens' rights. Otherwise, the citizens have no interest in entering into the state to begin with.
So before we before we went on air, I heard Lawrence snickering about this argument. So let's evaluate this argument. Do you all believe that the social contract argument justification for utilitarianism is a good one, a bad one, defensible? What?
Although it might be defensible in some circumstances, obviously you said that you ran it a lot and were very successful with it.
Well,
I think that but I think that in terms of the actual social contract theory, I'm not entirely sure how it would justify utilitarianism, since it seems as if the government's obligations are a little more specific than just in general protecting the people. So I know that I ran a case about the Lockean social contract, and Locke's one of the authors who has a theory of social contract that's similar to the one that I outlined earlier about there not being someone to adjudicate between rights claims in the state of nature or in a world without government. And I wasn't talking about maximizing life or having this government specifically protect rights in general, but I argued about them specifically being protected in certain instances. So my case was on the resolution that talked about whether there should be presumed consent for organ donation, and I argued that according to the social contract, we ought to affirm that resolution.
Okay. So Lawrence, maybe this is a question for you. So would you think that a government that was formed to safeguard the rights of its people is sort of doing a good job if it lets a bunch of them die?
I mean, probably not. It seems like it would contradict the reason for why we created the government in the first place, which is to prevent us all from dying in the state of nature.
Hmm. I think the main point of disagreement here, not that my argument is an argument that people really actually make, in social contract theory, but I think the main point of disagreement is like exactly what is the government designed to do, right? Is it just kind of just in place to just increase the utility counter of all the citizens, or is it designed to do, as Catherine suggested, maybe a little more specific set of things?
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely contractarian authors who are, base their moral intuitions in the social contract, who then use it to justify utilitarianism. But I think the reason it's not a very popular argument is because, as Catherine mentioned earlier, you could just use the social contract to justify a bunch of other different things that the government should do. I mean, as Catherine mentioned, the most popular author is John Locke, who didn't necessarily conclude that utilitarianism was, the correct moral theory. He was probably consequentialist to some degree, but whether or not he was a true utilitarian, I think, is really up for discussion.
Well, let's vote for whether or not this argument is good. I'm going to put in a solid thumbs up yes.
I'm going to go with the solid thumbs down no.
The tiebreaker vote. But I
I
know
think
how it's
I'm
going to go.
also going to agree with Lawrence in this instance that although it might be strategic based on your judge or based on your pairing, overall I think that based on the literature, the social contract doesn't necessarily justify utilitarianism.
To be clear, losing on a 2-1, it happens.
It does happen.
However, don't feel dissuaded from introducing this argument in debate rounds. Just now you know that when your opponent makes that argument, and this argument, by the way, is a Florida debate staple. Like this argument is just like in every single, or a lot of Florida debate rounds that I had, because framework debate in Florida was sometimes sparse. Okay, so 2-1 for social contract argument isn't the best, but feel free to introduce it now you also know how to answer it. So the second warrant for utilitarianism is that governments have to face a trade-off in adjudicating certain things, and utilitarianism is kind of the best philosophy suited for those sorts of decisions. Lawrence, can you talk us through this?
So this justification about government trade-offs is specific to governments. It's not necessarily about the individuals, so it may not help answer the question of what you as a person should do, but it does explain why the government, specifically as an entity, has to be utilitarian. So the problem that governments face is that there are a bunch of individuals, each with a bunch of different claims to something in society, so pieces of property or the right to do particular actions, et cetera, and it's really hard to pick which one should be prioritized over the other one. There are inevitable trade-offs when that governments have to deal with, because every action that the government allows or doesn't allow sort of trades off with someone else's ability to do something. So I think a common example is sort of just traffic laws. Limiting your ability to go 65 or 70 miles an hour or over that speed limit limits certain people from driving as fast as they want to, so it infringes upon their freedom. But it does probably save people's lives, because speed limits keep people from driving 105 miles an hour down a neighborhood road. And so in order to pick which course of action that a government should take, it's hard to use a non-utilitarian theory, because it can't really tell us what action we should take in a world in which there are trade-offs for everything they have to do. The government has to pick some action. They have to do something. So it requires them to be utilitarian, to maximize happiness, to minimize pain, in order to get the best outcome possible for its citizens.
So basically, it's just like choices are hard. Governments face a lot more dilemmas than maybe people face, and
Yeah, like
everything that they do hurts someone.
yeah, I don't have to regulate people. I don't have to be in charge of them, but the government has to set up laws. They have to have court systems to regulate disputes between people. They have to do a bunch of things, and it seems hard to be a non-utilitarian and figure out which course of action they should take.
Hmm. Okay. So, let's move to the evaluation section of this. Is this really an argument for utilitarianism or just for consequentialism?
So this argument's probably just consequentialist. It doesn't have to be utilitarian because a bunch of different authors think that, yeah, governments do have to make trade-offs, but does it have to necessarily be, in favor of happiness and minimizing pain? You could just instead choose to maximize liberty, for instance, or maximize rights and minimize rights violations and, minimize violations of liberty. So it doesn't have to be utilitarian, which I think is sort of a weakness of this argument.
Hmm. But it is still, obviously a point in utilitarianism's favor that it is consequentialist
Right.
with respect to this argument, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the very least, it forces the justification field into the realm of consequentialism, which would exclude a lot of different moral theories. Like, if
Interesting. Catherine, what do you think about this argument?
I think that it is definitely compelling since it seems that a lot of governments, when we think about them in the real world, do look to utilitarian calculus. And when examining certain pieces of evidence, I know that there are a few cards that are really common to be read when making this justification. It seems like a lot of them make descriptive claims, and I think that that can sometimes be a positive because it seems like a pretty good real world example. But then at the same time, it kind of shows what is as opposed to what ought to be, which seems to be a problem with the justification.
Hmm. So, so what part of the government sort of are we talking about here? Are we sort of talking about like legislative kind of executive branch thing? Because I know that like in the court system, for example, like utilitarianism is obviously like not a thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it seems to be about legislation, as when I think of most resolutions, they do have to do with passing legislation.
Okay. So, but kind of like within that realm, I don't know. Well, I'll just say it. I actually don't like this argument very much because I feel like a lot of governments actually have constraints that they really just can't break, and a lot of those
Oh,
constraints are related to things like the Bill of Rights and kind of moral principles. So personally, I think that
yeah.
there's some of those.
I
No,
think
I
some,
definitely agree with you. No worries.
yeah, but I do think there are some utilitarians that would say, well, the reason we follow these constraints, like the Bill of Rights, is because we're rule utilitarians, and we think that if we were to follow these constraints, like the Bill of Rights, it would make society better off in the long run. So inevitably, still is a utilitarian justification.
But I think that like sometimes people, actually don't even really go that far. Like I think that a lot of governments are really just like there's just some stuff that we just shouldn't do.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's just, some authors might disagree with that.
Oh well, you could say that about anything. Um, okay, well, let's get into voting. So I'm gonna put a thumbs down for this argument. Catherine, what do you think?
I'm also going to put a thumbs down for this argument. I might just not be a utilitarian, but I definitely agree with your point, Martin.
To give it a fighting chance, I'll give it a thumbs up just so I can lose. But
Ooh, the 2-1. Catherine on top again. All right, so again, I think this argument is perfectly defensible in debate rounds, and in fact, I regularly made it. But I think that upon some closer inspection, it maybe has some weaknesses.
now, obviously, we have not presented every argument in favor of utilitarianism, nor have we given you a comprehensive view about what utilitarianism is. There's still tons of debate and disagreement out there, and we've only presented to you a small picture of it. We hope that you're using this as an opportunity to get a general idea of what utilitarianism is and maybe how to defend it in debate rounds, but we hope this is mostly just a starting point for you to continue research into what utilitarianism is. And one resource that I found really helpful as a debater was the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it has entries about consequentialism and utilitarianism and has arguments for and against them, and it has very in-depth readings about what they are. So we would recommend that you check that out and continue your pursuit of knowledge of utilitarianism.
I can personally say that the deontological ethics section and as well as the consequentialism section of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy are very useful, and I often assign them to my debaters as things to read to increase general knowledge. So I definitely agree with that. So the next section is what is deontology? And we've talked all about what is utilitarianism, and I think got a pretty good picture of what that is. And in discussing utilitarianism, obviously, we've presented sort of deontology as the foil to utilitarianism. And my understanding, at least in a very basic way, is that deontology focuses on the means to achieve various things rather than on the things that you really are trying to achieve. Like, rather than focus on, rather than focus on maybe the information that you would get out of a terrorist, instead, deontology might focus on, say, torturing a terrorist kind of being inherently wrong. Catherine, what is your sort of basic understanding of deontology?
Yeah, I think I have a pretty similar conception. I've always learned that deontology, which doesn't necessarily focus on the ends of an action, rather focuses on treating individuals as ends in themselves, which I think basically means that we're just going to look to the means. We want to treat people with dignity, respect their autonomy and their rights in general, as opposed to in the long run.
All things that we will talk about shortly. I have a question for both of you. So deontology, as it's run in debate rounds, is usually just Kant, right? Immanuel Kant's deontology. That's mostly what we're talking about here. I mean, that is what you were talking about when you're talking about, using people as a means to an end and stuff like that, right, Catherine?
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's one of the most prevalent frameworks run in debate.
I know that I read some deontology arguments in some rounds, though, that weren't exactly Kantian. They were just kind of just weak sauce, like individual rights are good, we shouldn't break them, without exactly going into Kant. I do think, though, that Kant provides maybe some of the better warrants for deontology. What is your overall opinion of Kant's philosophy, Lawrence?
I ran Kant a lot as a debater, even in finals of NSDA Nationals, actually, because I feel like it's a very strategic argument that is intuitive, it makes sense for a lot of people, and it has a lot of logic behind it and a lot of philosophical history. So I actually really like Kant as an argument.
The categorical imperative is basically Kant's ethical theory. Obviously Kant is a philosopher. Immanuel Kant, German dude from the 18th century, had a lot to say about just like philosophy in general, but his ethical theory was called the categorical imperative. Categorical because it applies all the time. Imperative because you got to do it. And it says two things. The first thing it says is that you have to treat people as ends in themselves, which basically means you can't kind of use them as a cog in the machine. You can't you aren't allowed to abuse people, actual people like you, for your own like random purposes. Because the idea is that people are kind of intrinsically valuable and they have some amount of worth that you shouldn't just sacrifice for no reason. And then the second sort of related test for the categorical imperative is, does your action, would it make sense kind of if everyone was allowed to do it? And Kant had this kind of weird theory that his thought was that morality came from from our rationality. The fact that we're rational gives us certain moral sensibilities, and that was kind of the source of a lot of our morality, our ability to reason. And Kant thinks that reason is the same for everyone in the sense of like, that reason that gives people moral, I don't know, powers, responsibilities, is the same across everyone. So if you use your reason to make a moral argument, then that argument, has to be usable by everyone else. Otherwise, it's inconsistent. Is basically Kant's argument. This is called the universalizability test or the universality test. I've never quite figured out which of those it was. And the general idea is that you take actions and you see if everyone could reasonably do them and they would still make sense. One example that I use is stealing. I think that for Kant, you can make an argument that stealing is not universalizable. And what's important here is that the reason that it's not universalizable actually has nothing to do with the consequences. It's not like, oh, if everyone stole, then it would be bedlam. That's not what Kant actually thinks. I think Kant thinks instead that if everyone just stole from everyone else all the time, private property like really wouldn't even exist because everyone would just be, jacking property from everyone else whenever they wanted to. And as a consequence, it kind of doesn't really make sense to steal anymore because what are you stealing from? Private property doesn't exist. So those two ways of the categorical imperative, I found that they're actually linked. I think Kant explicitly links them. He basically says that, using people as a means to an end is not universalizable because you're using your reason to kind of like undermine the reason of somebody else. Did I basically get that right, Catherine?
Yeah, as far as my conception goes, I think that the two are very connected in that way.
Okay, so we have two common justifications for deontology, and the first one has to do with something I've already kind of talked about a little bit. So has to do with something called autonomy. Catherine, what is autonomy, and why does Kant like it so much?
So autonomy is basically your ability to make your own choices. And I think that Kant likes autonomy so much, or the conception of it, because having autonomy and having the ability to set your own ends ensures, to some extent at least, that someone else is not going to be using you as a means to an end. And I think that this is a really common justification that I heard in lay rounds a lot, so at CFLs or NSDA nationals, because it seems really intuitive that it's really good for people to be able to make their own choices and be able to set their own ends. And I think that even when you're at a varsity circuit level, this is a pretty good justification in terms of making arguments about some more complicated terms like publicly justified reason.
What do you mean by set your own ends? What do you mean by ends?
So I think that in terms of autonomy, it basically does mean to be able to make your own choices, be able to choose what you want to do with your life. So someone can't use me by lying to me, and someone can't make me go get them a sandwich, for example. But if I wanted to go get myself a sandwich and eat it, then that would be setting my own ends in a common example that's not about morality.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the kind of basic idea is that autonomy is important. We should be able to make our own decisions. And that's kind of important regardless of the consequences of some of those decisions.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely true for Kantian philosophy, specifically because if you're making certain decisions and you're intending to do certain things, it doesn't really matter what the outcome of that act is if our choice or our intention is morally right.
Yeah. I definitely agree here. Let's go let's go to the next argument. I think that we've spent enough time on the evaluations of these arguments. Let's talk about human dignity. So this is the second justification for deontology. What exactly is human dignity, Catherine?
So I think that there are a few ways to conceptualize human dignity, but generally, I suppose it just means that we're going to be like treating everyone fairly, or we're going to recognize that everyone has like human worth to begin with.
Human worth, and that worth is kind of not tied to your happiness level, right?
Yeah, definitely not. I think that even if you're the most unhappy person on earth, Kant would say that you're still going to be entitled to human worth or human dignity.
And that's a justification for deontology because, like, certain people should have some amount of respect for them.
Yeah, despite their decisions or despite their happiness levels, they should be able to be respected and they should be able to have certain rights like autonomy, which we just talked about.
Catherine, are you familiar with kind of the Francis Cam set of arguments
Um,
for
I'm
this?
I'm not sure if I am. Do you think you could explain them?
Well, so there was one argument that I remember, and I think this is kind of tied to human dignity and kind of not, but I think one of the basic arguments that Cam was making is like, look, utilitarianism is convinced that it's important to help people, that it is important to ensure that there are more people around, that we should ensure that those people are happy. But one kind of baseline assumption, and this is Francis Cam's argument, one kind of baseline assumption here is that those people are kind of worth, protecting in the first place. Because what's the point of kind of, saving 30 people if you don't think any of them are important in some respect, like important as humans?
Yeah, definitely. I think that that's a really compelling argument or objection to the utilitarian claim that we are going to be looking to utilitarianism by saving the most amount of people. Because first, we would have to recognize that there is this human dignity and this human worth, which is intrinsically a deontic idea.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people think it's like, hey, if what you're doing by quote unquote, maximizing lives is, you're kind of undoing a little of the moral work that you've done because you're saying that the things that you're saving are actually not even very important because there's sorts of things that you can sacrifice whenever you want. So it's kind of like, you have more of a thing, but that thing is now worthless.
Yeah, exactly.
So I always found that argument very interesting. It's pretty complicated though, um, so maybe there's some advanced utility, pun intended, that you can get out of this in debate rounds.
Yeah, I
And
think that it can be applied to a lot of different common arguments for utilitarianism.
we're going to talk about some arguments against utilitarianism and arguments against deontology instead of arguments for util and deontology. See. Okay, so first off, for utilitarianism bad, we've selected a couple arguments to talk about, and one of them is a thought experiment, not unlike the trolley problem thing that we talked about earlier. Only this one's a little bit more medical. Catherine, what is your understanding of the sort of organs problem with utilitarianism?
So basically, this thought experiment sets up a question of whether it would be morally right for a doctor to kill one person in order to save many people. So the situation goes like this. If a healthy person with a bunch of different healthy organs, healthy liver, healthy kidney, healthy skin, walks into a hospital, a doctor probably would be morally wrong or possibly morally right under utilitarianism to kill that person in order to procure all the organs to give to multiple people who were dying in the hospital. According to utilitarianism, perhaps this would be okay because it would preserve a lot of lives, even if it meant killing one person. However, intuitionally, this seems really morally wrong because if you're going into a hospital, say for something unrelated to your organs or unrelated to that medical procedure whatsoever, then a doctor definitely doesn't seem to have the right to just choose whether your life is worth saving others' lives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And let me know if I'm kind of right about the intuition thing here. Um, is it kind of related to the fact that the person has sort of done nothing morally wrong, and they were just sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Yeah, exactly. According to this thought experiment, it's just as if a random person, even someone who was probably like a good person, just walked into a hospital and they were just chosen out of the blue to die in order to save other people's lives.
Lawrence, do you think that kind of the value of innocence is an important feature of this thought experiment, or do you think that it would be just as compelling if the person was, say, I don't know, a criminal or something?
I mean, there are definitely a bunch of variations of this thought experiment where they are a criminal, and there's a question of, is it okay to, like, instead of putting to someone to death and using the death penalty against them, can we just take their organs if they're a criminal to save a bunch of other people's lives? Or even if they weren't up for the death penalty, is it okay to kill a criminal and take their organs and give them to other people? And I think that it doesn't really change the central question, which is it okay to sacrifice one person to save a bunch of other people? And I think though the innocence part is interesting and throws a nice twist into it, it doesn't have to be present to make this objection reasonable, which is that we shouldn't sacrifice people, to save other people's lives.
Ultimately, though, this argument is kind of an appeal to visceral intuitions, right? Like, am I wrong in thinking that this is mostly just an intuitive judgment?
Probably, but it doesn't seem like it's relies solely on intuition, because we could use this to appeal to other moral principles, for example, deontology, to explain why there is something morally wrong about killing that one person to save 5 other people by stealing his organs.
But still, it's just that deontology can explain this intuition that we already have. It's not really that there's sort of a pre-existing argument.
Well, I mean, probably most moral theories have to rely on intuitions to some degree.
No, yeah, I'm not saying that this is a problem with this argument, but I just want to make sure that we kind of have the right label attached to it. This argument is really an intuitive argument against utilitarianism. Is that there's something deeply wrong with it because of what it would do in the case of a patient.
Yeah, I believe it's just like drawing out the conclusion to this argument and then rejecting it on face because we don't like the conclusion of utilitarianism, which is that it might permit chopping up one person to save a bunch of other people.
Okay. Okay, so Catherine, what do you think of this argument from is it good? Is it bad? Should I say it? Was I wrong to make this argument in debate rounds perspective?
I definitely think that this is a good argument to make, specifically based on different judges. If you have a judge that really wants you to hear intuitive arguments, then I think that this is a great argument to make. Because I think that there are very few people who intuitively feel as if it's a good thing. Like if I personally went to a hospital and was killed for my organs, I would not think that that was a very just thing to do, despite its utilitarian benefits. So I definitely think that it could be a strategic argument in specific instances as well as generally.
Now, that's a good point, Catherine, but what if your judge is wearing a lab coat, has a stethoscope, and has a bloody scalpel and kind of looks murderous?
I would probably question judge preferences at that point to begin with.
What are judge preferences? Oh, no.
But despite your judge, I think that this can be a pretty intuitive argument to make. Even if your judge seems to be almost scarily utilitarian.
Yes. Yeah. All right, Lawrence. What do you think about this argument?
Well, I think the utilitarian has 2 fairly easy ways to answer this sort of objection. And the first is just to bite the bullet and say, yeah, contrary to your intuition, we should, in fact, sacrifice that one person and save 5 others or 10 others or however many others, and just sort of accept the conclusion of this and argue that that is, in fact, good. Or the utilitarian can be like, well, this specific example doesn't really make that much sense because it would probably lead to worse outcomes in the future if every time you walked into the hospital, you risked getting chopped up by a doctor to save 5 other people. It would probably lead to less trust in the medical system, less people going to see their doctor, et cetera, and would probably result in worse conclusions in the future. So a utilitarian might just say the organ situation would just never happen because it's not how ethics and the long-term works.
So those are two like fairly substantial arguments against this thing. Do you believe that this is an argument that people should, probably make in their debate rounds, even if it's not without objection?
Oh yeah, I made this very similar vein of argument all the time when I was in high school and debating against utilitarianism.
I basically never did because I just ran utilitarianism all the time. I'm trying to think if I ever actually read straight up deontology. I mostly just introduced, if I didn't read util, which was rare, then I read some weird different consequence that was basically util. So I don't know. I didn't make the organs argument a lot, but yeah. Yeah, I'm like personally, I don't think that the objection is really that great. But I can see why it might be good to pull on the heartstrings of some pathos influenced judge. All right, so I think we have a 2-1 in favor of this argument, I believe. I sort of don't like it very much, but whatever. Okay. The next argument against utilitarianism has to do with calculations. And Lawrence, can you explain this argument?
Yeah, so there are a few different variations of the calculation objection, but the general premise is that utilitarianism sort of fails as an ethical principle because we can't really calculate consequences for a variety of different reasons. So we kind of talked about it earlier when we were talking about act versus rule utilitarianism, and that one problem with act utilitarianism was trying to calculate happiness using the hedonistic calculation that Jeremy Bentham drew up, and that obviously failed. And so this continues to be a powerful vein of objection to utilitarianism. And I think there are two very common ways to make the calculation objection. The first one just being you cannot predict the future, which means that people, when acting, don't really know if their actions are going to be best in the long run, which makes it kind of hard to be utilitarian because you never know if you're going to actually attain utilitarian outcomes. And the second one is that consequences aren't just limited to certain people. They stretch on and on into the future and affect many more people than you could have ever expected. I think a good example of this is the organs argument that we were talking about earlier, where in that one very specific limited instance, it might make sense to kill one to save five. But maybe because of long-term consequences that stretch on into the infinite future, it might not have been the best idea to kill that one person to save five, which makes utilitarianism really, really difficult to use.
So it was actually exactly that point that I wanted to ask you about. Is this really just an argument that util is difficult to figure out rather than an argument that util is bad? It sounds like a problem with implementing the moral theory in practice rather than a problem with maybe the way that the theory is organized.
Yeah, to me, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow from the premise. It doesn't seem to say utilitarianism is hard to use, therefore it is false. It just seems the conclusion is utilitarianism is difficult to use. But if in fact we should be consequentialists and care about outcomes, and in fact happiness is good and in fact pain is bad, well, it being hard to use doesn't mean it's the false moral theory.
Okay. Catherine, when I think about this argument, one thing that always springs to mind is kind of that it's kind of radical, like kind of crazy a little bit to argue that we can't know any of the outcomes of our actions, right? Like, am I wrong in thinking that saying that like it's impossible to figure out what consequences will result from our actions is kind of just like a little nuts?
I mean, I definitely understand that sentiment, or I don't know if sentiment's the right word. I definitely understand that thought, but I generally like this argument since it seems that even if we can know like the general outcome of our consequences, they doesn't entirely ensure that we know every single one of those outcomes and how they're actually going to affect the future. So I think the problem that this objection brings up is not actually so much that util is hard to use, because in some instances it's definitely not hard to use. The example of like it's probably wrong under util just to like, I don't know, have a nuclear war, for example. That's very common in debate. But I
Sounds
think
bad.
that, yeah, but I think that the problem that this objection really brings up is that util is very good or sometimes easy to use in those instances once we know what has happened and when we're actually evaluating the action, as opposed to using it as a decision-making procedure to begin with.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that what I meant by evaluation of action is that once an action occurs, maybe nuclear war after it occurred, we can obviously say that it was like a bad thing. But when we make decisions, it's very hard to tell whether an action will actually lead to nuclear war and whether there will actually be the extent of an impact or things such as that. Meaning that although it seems like it can be fairly intuitive to say that you can evaluate the consequences of it, that's simply implying that we are sure what the consequences are. Meanwhile, in most debate instances, we're evaluating questions from the perspective of whether we should make that decision to begin with.
So the sort of added uncertainty, maybe of the resolution, kind of complicates maybe some easy pictures that Util tries to paint.
Yeah, definitely. That's why I'm kind of fond of this argument, actually. I think I made it quite frequently.
My debaters introduce this argument as well, although they introduce it in maybe a little more skeptical ways sometimes. But so I think we have a we don't like this argument from Catherine. I'm gonna get or sorry, we do like this argument from Catherine, and I'm going to say that I don't like it very much, and I will let Lawrence cast the tie vote.
I'm not sure how great it is as an objection in a true sense, but I definitely read it every single debate round I was debating against utilitarianism, more than I brought up the organs example, actually. So I think this is a very solid argument against utilitarianism that's easy to make.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I definitely made this argument in like, national circuit caliber rounds a lot. Although sometimes it would be much abbreviated. I would just say something like, well, how do you know that the life you save isn't Hitler that kills people in the future? Got you. And then I would move on. But so I don't I don't think that level of brevity is exactly what we want, though. So okay, so we have a 2-1 in favor of this argument again, and of course I sit out on the sidelines yet again. Okay, so deontology then. Some objections to deontology. One common one that I think people say a lot is kind of just if an action is kind of the flip side actually of the organs argument. It's just a counterexample. And the argument here is just that it's unintuitive to suggest that we should kind of maximize our moral purity, and have our perfect intentions, have the means be absolutely perfect, if doing so would prevent kind of gruesome harm. And I think a common example of this, although I don't recommend bringing up the Holocaust a lot in debate rounds because it can normally be divisive and it's kind of the nuclear option of examples in debate, and then you get into silly debates about what side the Holocaust goes, which is I think very I don't recommend doing this a lot. But this example kind of makes sense here. Kantians don't think that you're allowed to lie, for example, basically under any circumstances. And so let's say you were in a house in Germany in the 40s and you were hiding Jews in your attic, and someone knocks on the door and says, hey, are there any Jews in your attic? And I think that the power of this objection on an intuitive level is that the harm in saying no seems to be very small compared to the harm in saying yes and having the Jews in your attic to be extradited to their doom. So my understanding of this point, and correct me if I'm wrong, is just that sometimes the actions with gruesome consequences should kind of trump a lot of other moral considerations.
Yeah, I definitely think that's what the argument is getting at. Although I'm not entirely sure that it's the best argument to make against deontology. Probably because I'm just very anti-utilitarian, as it might be fairly obvious from
Aha, the
which
truth
way
comes
I've
out.
been leaning. Yeah, I've never been trying to hide that truth. I am very much not a utilitarian. But it seems as, and here's why I don't actually find this objection too compelling in terms of the philosophy, is because it seems as if, like, the Holocaust was definitely a harm under deontology as well as utilitarianism. So it seems as if lying in this instance would not only prevent a utilitarian harm, but a deontological harm as well.
Oh, so you believe that maybe the consequences that occur as a result of your inaction, let's say, that those consequences count as deontological harms as well?
Yeah, I definitely think so.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
So,
So Lawrence, what do you got to say about this thing?
so definitely an interesting perspective on how to handle this objection, but I think the problem is that most deontologists think the conclusion is that you should not lie to the Nazis. And in fact, there are articles written by deontologists that directly respond to this argument, and their argument is still consistently you cannot lie to the Nazis. They give you a bunch of things that you can do, like you don't have to answer them, um, and you can just remain silent and not talk to them. But if you are to talk to them, you have to tell them, yes, I'm hiding Jews in my house, and you cannot lie to them because they are strong deontologists. So it seems like most deontologists accept the conclusion that you have to lie to the Nazis.
Hmm. This is an interesting back and forth that we have here. I'm gonna stake my claim that, like most arguments that exist, I don't think that this argument is really great. And like I said before, I really don't appreciate the use of excessive Holocaust examples in debate rounds. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I did find this argument very difficult to answer as a debater. And part of my problem was, um, basically no matter what I said in response to that, no matter what explanation I tried to give, it ended up sounding forced. It ended up sounding kind of not genuine. I ended up really not really believing the point that I was making and was kind of unable to sell it. But anyway, what do you think about this argument, Catherine?
I mean, I definitely agree with what Lauren said before that in terms of like strict deontology in the literature, there very well is like the case that you should just not respond to the Nazis or things such as that. But in terms of the debate round, I think that making arguments against it just about like the deontological claims or reasons as to why this like example doesn't necessarily apply to your framework, or why it might only apply in certain instances can be fairly compelling.
Okay, okay. And what do you think, Lawrence? Cast the deciding vote.
Um, I think it's an argument to be made, but it's probably not the most persuasive against deontology. Mostly because deontologists have developed, I think, a pretty coherent set of answers to this argument. Um, Not the least of which is just, well, this relies on you winning that we ought to care about consequences in the first place. So if you aren't a utilitarian already, this argument probably won't persuade you to become a utilitarian.
Fair enough. So I guess I'm on the right side of the issue this time, but only because I disagree with everything. The next argument for deontology bad is that rights tend to conflict with one another sometimes, and that makes it difficult under deontology to evaluate what you should do in cases of a moral dilemma. Say you have to violate something either way. If you have to save two drowning children and you kill either of them, by choosing the other one, then it seems that deontology is somewhat, you could say, paralyzing. It makes it difficult for you to make any decisions that you have to make in your moral life. So we don't have a lot of time. So real quick, what do you think about this argument, Catherine?
I think that it definitely is very compelling in comparison to most other arguments I hear about deontology. But the main problem I think with it is that when we think about the actions themselves, like whether you should save a drowning child or not, he probably should, despite the fact that if you save one, then you won't save the other. I don't think that it actually answers the question of whether the action itself is right or not. So I think that doing the like deontologically right action is still good in comparison to not doing so.
Interesting. From my perspective, so I actually disagree. I'm going to go that I actually like this argument. And part of the thing that I see is from the point of view of an individual making a decision, knowing that both of your possible courses of action is wrong, like they're just both wrong, isn't really particularly helpful because you still have to do something. Theoretically, I suppose you could let both people drown.
Mm-hmm.
That seems unfortunate. Anyway, Lawrence, what do you think about this argument?
I'm not sure how effective this argument is when applied to individuals, although I can see why it might be. I think this argument makes more sense when applied to the context of a government and why governments specifically cannot be sort of deontological. And I think we talked a lot about this earlier, because even Kant has an entirely distinct political philosophy that is different from his moral philosophy about deontology. And though his political philosophy is definitely deontological, it's not the straightforward deontology that we've been talking about, and it's more specific to governments because, in fact, governments do have to take care of rights trade-offs and have to make choices that inevitably will violate some people's dignity at the expense of other people's. So I think this argument is definitely persuasive, or at least more persuasive to me, in the context of a government.
Fair enough. Okay, so that's this section with respect to all of these arguments. We've talked about some arguments for utilitarianism, some arguments for deontology, as well as some arguments against deontology and against utilitarianism. And one thing that I think all of us would really want to stress is just because some of us maybe have itty-bitty problems with some of these arguments does not mean that you shouldn't, feel free to introduce those in any of your debates. You should just maybe be aware of what some of the objections would be. And it's important to think through some of these responses so that you can make them against your opponent's arguments and so that you've kind of thought through the argument in advance. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Catherine.
Thanks so much for having me.
You were... Well, everyone, that's the episode for this week. We were super lucky to be able to get Catherine Kenny on the podcast. She's so knowledgeable about all of this stuff, and we hope that you enjoyed this foray into philosophy as much as we did, honestly. And, I was a philosophy major in college. This is really my kind of stuff. This is stuff that I really appreciated. I did it a lot as a debater, despite what you may have heard from me on the podcast, just saying that I went for Util in every debate. And, I really didn't, but it was fun nonetheless. And so Lawrence, what did you think about the episode? How do you think it went?
And once again, we'd want to remind you that even though we're telling you a lot of good stuff about utilitarianism versus deontology, this isn't the ending point for your, pursuit of knowledge. This should be the starting point, and you should continue to do more research about these philosophical concepts because these are complex philosophical debates that have been happening for hundreds of years, and we're barely scratching the surface of it. And so we hope that you go out and do more research about these subjects.
Definitely true. And now for our most important segment of the podcast, the mini debate we have at the end. So I'm going to select the topic of favorite book. And I'll go first so I can give Lawrence some time to furiously think about what his favorite book is and some arguments in favor of it. My favorite book is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. It's actually a very famous book. It was written after World War II and is kind of just hysterically funny at times and sometimes just really depressing book about a camp of people in World War II. It's an extremely absurd book. It's incredibly well written, and it's just stood the test of time. It's really just honestly my absolute favorite book to read. It talks about the horrors of warfare in kind of good detail, but it also discusses warfare from a very absurdist perspective. And I thought it was really funny. I enjoy reading it to this day. So Lawrence, what is your, I will make the argument that Catch-22 is the best book. that I have read at least. So what is your argument? What are you going to contend?
It's so hard to select because you've picked a book with historical significance, and I could pick, from a bunch of books that have won prizes, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the book that stands out to me most is probably The Tower Treasure, which is the first book in the Hardy Boys series, and it's the first book that I remember reading, and I think it's the book that got me most hooked onto reading as a young student, because I'd read a little bit, I guess, as much as a normal kid prior to this. But when I got into fourth grade and I started reading the Hardy Boys books just nonstop, to get more book points, or I forget what the point system was back in elementary school, but you got points for like reading books.
Yeah. I know what you mean. It was like accelerated reading or something.
Yeah, that.
I don't remember exactly what it was called.
And this is when I had first moved to Oklahoma, and I had only like maybe 2 months left in the school year, and I really wanted to get to the top of my class's accelerated reading program, in terms of points. Obviously, I was like a whole year behind, so I I didn't really try it that hard at first, but when I started reading the Hardy Boys books, and the first one was The Tower Treasure, I really got hooked onto the series, and I read basically the entire series over the course of about a month and a half, and ended up topping up my class's accelerated reading points, beating everyone who had been reading for the entire year and taking tests for it. And that's why this book means the most to me, despite it probably not meaning that much to very many other people.
Okay, well, Lawrence didn't even really talk about the topic that I presented. Maybe Hardy Boys is the best book that Lawrence has ever read. I'm still gonna. I read Harry Potter just as much as the next kid, probably like 10 times. But I'm still gonna go with Catch-22 still.
You're probably right,
just
because
completely crush the Hardy Boys.
Probably right. I will admit defeat, but I still maintain that the Hardy Boys books was good, and it probably sparked the interest in mystery novels for a bunch of young kids, and that's all that matters.
Ooh, did you read? When I was a kid, I read about the Boxcar Children.
That was also a really good series.
Dude, I love those books. Those books were awesome. It was just like a bunch of like, I think they're like homeless kids. They're like traveling around, but they just like live in boxcars and stuff.
Well, the first book is like they live in a boxcar, but it turns out they do have a family member who's quite wealthy, and eventually, they just live in a boxcar basically on a wealthy estate, and they just do stuff.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I love those series. The Boxcar Children. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, like for a while they just lived in a boxcar, and like the oldest brother would just walk, to the farm to work. And eventually they figured out, oh wait, you literally live in like an abandoned boxcar. And then they find out they have family, so.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm sure a deep metaphor about our relationship with nature and homelessness and capitalism. I'm sure that's what the Boxcar Children books were really about, right, Lawrence?
Maybe, but as a fourth grader reading those books, I was mostly just like, man, I'd like to live in a boxcar.
Fourth grader, I thought, well, I guess I am a little older than you. Yeah, I probably read those books when I was like in second or third grade or something. That's probably why I don't remember any of them.
I might have read them earlier, honestly, but I just can't really recall second grade me doing that, like reading those types of books. I think second grade me was just reading whatever was assigned in school and not much else.
Oh, Lawrence, you're a national treasure. Okay, so we're gonna rule that Catch-22 is the best book, and I'm gonna declare myself the arbitrary winner yet again. It's 2 for me. Okay, so some quick housekeeping. You should like us on all of the different social media accounts. If you actually like the podcast, if you hate it, you should leave an angry review and send us a strongly worded all caps email about it, or just whisper to all your friends that you don't like us very much. So we have a Facebook page. That's the Argument Clinic Facebook page. We have our Twitter, which is called Argument Clinic. We have a Gmail account that you can direct all your inquiries towards. That's theargumentclinicpodcast@gmail.com. Feel free also to we post on the debate Reddits, with our newest episodes. Feel free to leave a comment on SoundCloud or to follow us on SoundCloud or subscribe or whatever it's called to the newest episodes. Leave a comment, say that you like the soothing sound of my voice or that you just hate my voice and would rather listen to Lawrence all the time, which is a very reasonable thing to say. And lastly, if you could please leave an iTunes review, especially if you're listening to this through iTunes. My understanding is that if you leave an iTunes review, then other people who are searching for us will be able to find us more easily. And I guess actual last thing, tell your friends. We are very interested in making sure that everyone, given that this is a podcast for everyone, that there are a lot of different people from different backgrounds that get a chance to listen to this. So if you know someone that could maybe benefit from it, please just send them a link to the SoundCloud page or something, and help us out. And one last thanks to our sponsor, Victory Briefs, a preeminent debate camp across the country. They're responsible for a lot of our financial woes, so you should totally check them out. And that's this episode for this week. Thanks for hanging us out this lovely Thursday, and stay frosty.
No, this isn't an argument.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't. It's just contradiction.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It is not.